Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. I realize I have been MIA for quite a while. May was ridiculously busy for me. I was in Vegas, Raleigh, Albuquerque, Napa, and at the beginning of June, my family took a vacation to Lake Tahoe, which was absolutely amazing. Highly recommend. Then came Father's Day, my birthday, which is also the podcast anniversary. 4 freaking years. Can you even believe it? I cannot express my appreciation to those who subscribe and continue to download every new episode. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. Well, I am finally back with another true crime story suggested by 2 of my listeners, Lorraine Purdon and Sarah Johnston. Thank you for your suggestions. Keep them coming. This is the tragic story of the Turpin family. Parents David and Louise Turpin and their 13 children. You heard that right, 10 daughters and 3 sons. Are you ready for this? It's one of those alliteration families that makes you wonder how the hell they keep it straight. Jennifer, Joshua, Jessica, Jonathan, Joy, Julianne, Janetta, Jordan, Joanna, James, Jalinda, Jalissa, and Jana. I only have one child, and I struggle to keep his name straight from the dogs. Why so many children, you ask? Well, according to David and Louise, God called upon them to do so. Small spoiler alert, no one is killed in this story today, but it's far from a happy ending. The Turpin case is difficult to hear, and if child abuse is triggering for you, you may want to skip this episode. For those who aren't tapping out, let's jump into it. Starting with a little background on David Turpin. David was born October 17th, 1961 to parents Jim and Betty Turpin in Princeton, West Virginia. The Turpin family was uber religious. David was considered awkward and a bit of a nerd as he grew up. And if you see pictures of him, you can see that he never really grew out of that awkward stage. His haircut reminds me of the fictional movie character Bucky Larson. If you know, you know. David graduated from high school in 1979, earning a scholarship to attend Virginia Tech, where he went on to study electrical engineering. Louise Robinette was born May 24th, 1968 to parents Alan and Phyllis, also in Princeton, West Virginia. Her family, which included 2 younger sisters, was also quite religious, and they attended the same church as the Turpins. Unfortunately, Louise's parents didn't get along that well. Their constant fighting created a poor environment for the girls, and they were often neglected. When Louise's mother, Phyllis, was a child, she was sexually abused by her father, John. Just to make sure you're all following, Phyllis is Louise's mother, and John is Phyllis's father. So this would be Louise's maternal grandfather. I just threw a lot of names at you, and trust me, the story just gets more and more populated, and I can't lose you already. John felt very highly of himself. He was a decorated war veteran and involved in local politics. He owned numerous businesses in town and was a very wealthy man. Let's go ahead and add incestual pedophile to that list. Unfortunately, the sexual abuse didn't stop with Phyllis. When Phyllis took Louise and her sisters to visit Grandpa John, he abused them too. During one of their visits, Phyllis's mother walked in on John raping Louise. She grabbed a frying pan and chased him out of the house. I wasn't able to find documentation of what became of that marriage. This happened when Louise was just 14 years old. Not long after this, Alan and Phyllis divorced. Alan moved out and into his own home. Picture you are Phyllis. You would think after your father sexually abused you as a child and now your children, you would turn him into the police, or at the very least stay far, far away from him, especially experiencing the same awful trauma yourself. But no, Phyllis continued to visit John, taking her vulnerable daughters along because she needed money from him. He continued to abuse the girls and several of their female cousins as well. The family never reported the abuse or discussed it with anyone outside of the family. Growing up, Louise didn't have many friends and was bullied in school. She and David knew each other because they grew up attending the same church every Sunday. When David was 21 and Louise was just 14, they secretly started dating. Phyllis didn't see a problem with the couple, but didn't tell Alan. She knew he wouldn't approve of his daughter dating a much older man. I mean, allowing your 14-year-old to date an adult man 7 years her elder is nothing compared to allowing her to be raped by her grandfather. No wonder Louise is so messed up. But at some point, you need to see the light and break the cycle of abuse. In 1984, David graduated with his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and was hired by General Dynamics in Fort Worth, Texas. Louise did not want to be separated, so one morning she packed a bag and David checked her out early from school. Together, they drove to Texas so they could start their new life. She is a minor, and this could be considered kidnapping. Alan and Phyllis reported Louise as a missing person, and the police did find her in Texas with David. Alan and Phyllis were relieved she was safe. They knew they wouldn't win this battle with Louise and asked them both to return home so they could have a proper wedding in their hometown church. David, aged 23, and Louise, 16, were pronounced husband and wife February 11, 1985, with only close family present. After the wedding, they drove right back down to Texas. They lived in Fort Worth for 2 years and then relocated to Brea, California. David made pretty good money at his job, and they were living very comfortably. In 1988, they flew Phyllis and Louise's sisters out to California for Christmas, footing the bill of the entire trip. And by this time, the couple had their first child, Jennifer. However, in 1990, David was transferred back to Fort Worth for work. His salary was over $100,000 a year, which is pretty freaking good for the early 90s. Phyllis and Louise's sisters came back year after year to visit, with David paying their expenses each time. This went on for the next 10 years. In 1992, their second child, Joshua, was born. Shortly after, the couple filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. While David had a pretty well-paying job, they were living way beyond their means, racking up a huge amount of debt on credit cards. And on top of this, they both developed a gambling addiction. Louise never mentioned their financial difficulties to her family, and they continued to finance the annual visit from her mother and sisters. The third Turpin child, Jessica, was born in 1993. The eldest, Jennifer, started kindergarten the next year and was picked on due to her poor hygiene and wearing the same dirty clothes day after day, which must have been pretty apparent for a 5 to 6-year-old to comment on. Baby number 4, Jonathan, was born in 1995. Not long after Jonathan's birth, the Turpin family made a trip home to West Virginia and continued spending money they did not have, taking everyone out to lavish restaurants. But this was all for show. The children did not have the privilege of eating at restaurants back home. Only Louise and David got to do that. Louise's younger sister, Elizabeth, who was in college at the time, asked if she could come stay with her and David for the summer. After a quick discussion, they agreed. Elizabeth traveled back to Texas with the Turpins. She quickly noticed that the couple was extremely strict with the kids. They had to ask permission to eat or even go to the bathroom. The children were fed at the table one at a time. Each child had to make eye contact with Louise, smile, and wait to be given permission to sit down and eat. Louise and David were not affectionate towards the kids whatsoever. They all stayed in their rooms unless it was time to go to school, mealtime, or they had to use the bathroom, which they had to ask permission to use. And permission was not always granted. Can you imagine? Elizabeth was not allowed to interact with the kids unless Louise or David was present. She was not permitted to use the house phone either. If the house rules were broken, Louise was the one who decided on the proper punishment, and David carried it out. Elizabeth landed herself a summer job, and that also came with a strict set of rules. Louise would drive her to and from work. She was not allowed to make friends or tell anyone their home address. Louise threatened that if Elizabeth broke any of these rules, she would kick her out. So Elizabeth did as she was told. I would be seriously tempted to hitch a ride back to West Virginia. Elizabeth later reported that there were multiple occasions where Louise and David picked the lock on the bathroom door, snuck inside while she was in the shower. Then once she stepped out, they would point and laugh at her. They never touched her, but still falls into sexual abuse in my book. How mortifying and uncomfortable to continue living in a house with these monsters. Eventually, Elizabeth did make a friend at work. One day she met that friend for lunch and Louise was furious. Elizabeth was not allowed to return to the house for 3 days. She finally threatened to call the police, so Louise allowed her inside, but just to retrieve her belongings. Elizabeth packed up and returned to West Virginia, dodging a bullet. In 1997, Joy was born. A year later, another girl named Julianne. Soon after her birth, the family went to West Virginia for what turned out to be their final visit. While they didn't travel back home anymore, the couple did routinely drive to Louisiana to gamble, digging themselves deeper into financial debt. In 1999, their house was foreclosed on for multiple months of unpaid mortgage. The kids were pulled out of school, and moving forward, none of them would ever receive a formal education. Money problems? Have another kid. Baby number 7, Janetta, was born that same year. The family relocated to a house outside of Rio Vista, Texas, which they financed through a different bank. Honestly, surprised anyone would give them a loan after their last home was foreclosed on. It is typical when moving into a new home that your neighbors will introduce themselves or bring you a housewarming gift. My go-to is homemade banana bread. Well, the Turpins weren't having any of that and completely closed themselves off to the neighbors and their friendly gestures. As usual, the kids were not allowed to make any friends. In fact, they were forbidden to even tell anyone their names. Since neighbor kids kept attempting to play and make friends with the Turpin children, Louise stopped letting them go outside. Neighbors would hear the kids playing at night in the backyard, but never saw them during the day. Here is where things take a turn for the worst. Not only were they forced to stay in their rooms, but the kids were chained to their beds. Louise and David built a cage in the basement that was divided into 2 sections. Children were locked in the cage, sometimes for days if they didn't follow the rules. They were still only fed once a day, 1 child at a time, in silence. As I stated earlier, they were not always allowed to use the bathroom, which is so messed up. How can you not allow your children to relieve themselves? They would hold it as long as possible, but eventually, with no other choice, they'd let it out right there in their beds, which was certainly not cleaned up by Louise or David. Water use within the house was rationed. Bathing or showering for the children was forbidden, like ever. If the kids wet their hands above their wrists, they were considered to be wasting water and were punished. I'm surprised they were even allowed to wash their hands. Punishments included losing food privileges, no drinking water, or being locked in a cage for days. They were already eating once per day, so I assume that meant an entire day without any food at all. Physical punishments were also common, such as slapping or spanking with a belt. In 2000, another baby girl, Jordan, was born. A year later, in 2001, Louise had another baby boy named James. After his birth, David's parents came to visit the family. They later said that everything seemed fine and normal to them. I'm sure they put on a show and made sure everyone wore their fake smile. In 2002, Joanna was born. Boom, 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 boom. That was 4, one right after another. To avoid actual visits from family members, Louise sent frequent pictures and updates of the kids. In 2004, David and Louise purchased a new double-wide mobile home and moved it into the property behind the main house. That same year, Jolinda was born. Jalissa followed in 2006. I lost count. I think that makes 12 kids? The double-wide was getting a bit crowded, so David and Louise rented an apartment in a town about 40 minutes away from Rio Vista, taking the younger children, Jolinda and Jalissa, with them. They left the older kids behind, and every few days, David would return and drop off canned or frozen food at the house. Jennifer and Joshua were left in charge of enforcing the rules and punishing those who broke them. Jennifer did run away once, but with no identification and no means of supporting herself, she ended up calling Louise, who brought her home to be punished. The parents continued to control the kids through phone calls and threats of what would happen to those who broke the rules. Louise and David also began making frequent trips to Las Vegas in an attempt to win their money back. That never happened. In 2010, David lost his job and the family was forced to relocate once again. They left everything behind and abandoned their house before they could be foreclosed on. Days later, a neighbor entered the house to investigate. They heard the Turpins' dogs barking and crying for days. The 2 family dogs had been left to starve inside of the filthy house. It was covered in feces and urine. The cage in the basement was discovered, but at the time was believed to be a dog cage. Abusing and torturing your kids is evil and unthinkable, but leaving these 2 poor dogs to starve to death, I hate these 2 with a passion. One bedroom had 6 bunk beds, and all beds had ropes attached to them. The refrigerator, cabinets, and closets were all padlocked. You'd think this would raise suspicion for police and they would perhaps try to find these people. The family moved to Murrieta, California in 2011. David registered their new property as a private school, so the children weren't expected to attend public school or even leave the house. Even though the den was set up as a classroom with desks, no education took place. It was just for looks. David landed a job as a computer engineer at Northrop Grumman. His work hours were from 2 to 10 p.m., so the children were expected to keep a similar schedule. They would wake up at midnight and go to bed around 6 a.m. His salary was decent for the time, around $150,000 a year, but it wasn't enough for the sole breadwinner to support a family of 14. The Turpins owed about $250,000 to creditors, and it all came crashing down. David had no other choice but to declare bankruptcy again. In February 2011, David and Louise traveled to Las Vegas to renew their wedding vows. They left all 12 kids home alone for the weekend, and after posting pictures of their vow renewal on social media, the couple received many inquiries about the children and if they were well. David's brother and his family wanted to visit in person, but they were repeatedly told that the timing wasn't right. In July of 2011, Louise and David took their kids to Disneyland. They were allowed to bathe, shockingly, and were given matching new clothes. They took family pictures to share on social media, giving the illusion they were one big, really big, happy family. In September 2013, so only 2 years later, the whole family went to Vegas for David and Louise to renew their vows yet again. The photos show the girls in all matching pink plaid dresses and the boys in black suits with pink ties. In spite of the happy faces in the posted photos, the children were severely malnourished and isolated. The new clothes were taken away after the photos, and they again were forced to wear the same dirty clothes day after day. They went back to not being allowed to bathe and were confined to their rooms. Sheets and clothing were never washed. They weren't allowed to watch TV, listen to the radio, or have any access to the outside world. The physical abuse also continued. The girls were frequently punished by Louise grabbing their hair and slinging them around the room. They were also slapped or punched and chained to their bed for days or even weeks at a time. The only form of entertainment that was allowed, the kids were encouraged to keep journals. However, without a formal education, their reading and writing skills were severely lacking. In 2014, David and Louise purchased a brand new 4-bedroom home in Paris, California. Again, who the hell is giving these people loans? I don't get it. Each bedroom had 2 sets of bunk beds, so 4 kids in every room. Each bed was equipped with its own chain and padlock. The kids were not allowed to leave their designated area or interact with the siblings from other rooms. Louise instructed her 4 favorite children, Jennifer, Joshua, Julianne, and Janetta, to spy on the other kids and report any rule breakers. She gave them gifts, and they were allowed to leave the home occasionally as an incentive to be the quote-unquote hall monitors. At one point, Louise allowed Jennifer to have a cell phone and a social media account, but was quickly taken away when Jennifer downloaded an app that Louise didn't approve of. Joshua was occasionally allowed to watch TV with his parents. The kitchen in particular had to be monitored at all times, since the children were constantly deprived of food and would routinely steal if given the opportunity. Big air quotes there, like steal your own food. David and Louise would buy pies and other baked goods that they would leave on the counter in plain sight, but the kids were not allowed to eat any of it. Pure torture for a starving child. They were fed only peanut butter sandwiches, bologna sandwiches, or frozen burritos and chips, even though David and Louise continued to eat out at restaurants. Surprisingly, Joshua was allowed to enroll at a community college. He started with basic classes like algebra, English, public speaking, and music. He did very well and was an honor student. Louise drove him to and from class every day, usually waiting in the hallway until his class was over. Talk about helicopter mom. A female student approached him one day and tried to make conversation. Joshua asked his mother if he could be friends with the girl, and Louise said yes. But Joshua never returned to class after that. In 2015, Louise became pregnant for the 13th and final time. After Jana was born, the couples posted pictures of themselves with the baby online. The other children were not shown, and people began to ask about them. David and Louise went to Vegas to renew their vows again and took all the children with them. Honestly, though, is this just an excuse to go to Las Vegas? Who the hell needs to renew their vows so often? I think bringing the children along is purely because it's a chance to capture a family picture to post to the gram. The absolute worst example of Instagram versus reality. In 2016, Jennifer shows some kindness to her younger sister Jordan, allowing her to use the cell phone and go online. When Louise finds out, she choked Jordan. This is when Jordan snaps. She makes a plan to escape this hellhole. Around Christmas of that year, Jonathan, Jalinda, Jalissa, and Janetta were caught stealing food from the kitchen, and they were chained to their beds. They were only allowed to be unchained in order to watch their siblings take part in good treatment. The good kids were fed more and allowed to interact with their parents and with each other in the common areas. The kids are all allowed to bathe on Mother's Day of 2017 for the first time in a year, and a picture is taken for social media. As usual, the new clothes are immediately taken away after the photo is posted, and the filthy clothes are put back on. Louise's mom, Phyllis, becomes ill and is on her deathbed. But Louise refuses to speak with her. She doesn't attend the funeral because they had already planned a trip to Las Vegas. When her father later dies, Louise says they can't attend because she wasn't given enough notice. Notice of a death? Like, hey, let's plan for your dad to die next month, say the 14th at 6 p.m.? In December 2017, Josh gives Jordan his old cell phone. Even though service has been disconnected, Jordan is able to use Wi-Fi to access the internet and set up social media accounts under an alias. She began to chat with a boy in India named Nolesh Patbar. So sorry, I'm positive I butchered that, but she tells him about her living situation. Nolesh encourages Jordan to escape and alert the police to what is happening at the home. Right before Christmas 2017, David learned that he will be getting transferred to Oklahoma City, and the family begins packing for the move. January 14th, 2018 is when Jordan makes her move. 17-year-old Jordan escapes, clutching the deactivated cell phone. Once she is a safe distance away and gets a Wi-Fi signal, she used the phone to call 911. She told the dispatcher that she and her 12 siblings were being horribly abused by her parents. She also stated that 2 of her younger sisters and a brother were currently chained up inside of the house. An officer was sent to Jordan's location, and she repeated the same information to him. Along with her statements, Jordan was able to show the officer pictures on the cell phone which appeared to corroborate with what she was saying. Officers quickly arrived at the Turpin home and began knocking on the door. After nearly 8 minutes, the door was answered by a seemingly shocked Louise. The officers were able to make entry into the home due to there being a concern for the safety and welfare of the children inside. The officers' body cams captured the scenes inside of the home as they searched for the children. The home was filthy and smelly with piles of garbage everywhere. Louise and David claimed that they were in the process of packing to move, and that's why the house was so messy. All of the girls were unchained by the time police gained entry, but one son, Jonathan, was found chained to his bed. The children were taken to local hospitals for treatment, and the parents were immediately placed under arrest. David and Louise were arrested on 12 counts of torture, 12 counts of false imprisonment, 7 counts of cruelty to an adult dependent, 6 counts of willful child cruelty, 1 count of lewd act by force or fear, on David only, 8 counts of perjury, on David for registering the home as a private school, and 10 counts of child endangerment. There was a restraining order put in place to prevent them from contacting the kids. Their bond was set at $9 million each. All of the kids were found to be 20 to 50 pounds underweight. They had vitamin deficiencies, and some had skeletal abnormalities due to being restrained. Most had cognitive deficiencies and muscle wasting. 2 of the older girls were so damaged that they will never be able to have children. They all suffered from PTSD and other psychological problems. The news of the case spread worldwide, and donations poured in for the kids. After 2 months in the hospital, the adult children were taken to secure, supervised housing to learn how to take care of themselves. They learned personal hygiene, cooking, cleaning, and basic finance. The 6 younger children were placed into 2 foster homes. All of them cried when they had to leave the hospital because it was the best environment they had ever been in. David and Louise pled not guilty to all their charges in the preliminary hearing. The prosecutor laid out his case and played Jordan's 911 call. As a result of the overwhelming evidence, David and Louise agreed to a plea deal that allowed them to plead guilty to 14 counts of torture and abuse in February of 2019. Prosecutors made sure that they pled to at least 1 charge per child. They were sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The kids were allowed to make statements to the court. Although they were glad that the ordeal was over, the children did express love for their parents and even tried to explain their behavior as being overwhelmed and afraid that they would lose their kids if they asked for help. As I stated at the beginning of this episode, while they had been rescued from their house of horrors, this story is far from a happy ending for the Turpin siblings. The younger children were placed into foster care and eventually adopted by a family. Sounds great, right? In July of 2022, the 6 youngest children filed a lawsuit against Riverside County and ChildNet Youth and Family Services, which is a private foster care agency. I know I'm going to mess this name up as well. Marcelina Olguin, the foster father, was arrested in January 2021. He was charged with 13 counts, including a lewd act with a child and willful child cruelty. He is accused of grabbing 2 of the girls, fondling their buttocks, legs, and breasts, forcibly kissing them on the mouth, and making sexually suggestive comments. Marcelino's wife, Rosa, and their daughter, Lenny, were also charged with fraud and witness intimidation, as well as physical and psychological abuse to all 9 of the children in their care. Another allegation is that the children would be forced to eat until they vomited, and then be forced to eat the vomit. So they go from being tortured by starvation to gluttony. The foster family would urge the children to kill themselves and constantly threaten to return them to their biological parents. One foster parent told one of the girls that she understands now why her parents chained her up. What a horrible human being. The Olguins deny all the charges and the case is still pending. Jordan is the most well-known Turpin child, not only because she was the one who bravely escaped and found help for her siblings, but has also been most open with speaking to the media. She was one of the children under the care of the Olguins, and she had this to say, quote, "I'm not ready to go into details about what happened to me in that home. I was very traumatized, and it's been a very scary journey," she said. "It was really hard to understand that the first situation with my parents, then going into another that was just really, really hard. You have all these questions, and you just don't get the answer." The Turpin children have reported being denied access to funds raised for them by several nonprofit organizations, as well as providing pro bono care offered to them by local businesses, including doctors and dentists. According to an article written for ABC News, much of the $600,000 in private donations has been kept from the Turpin siblings. County officials, citing court-ordered secrecy, have refused to provide ABC News with any information about the trusts, including how much money has been distributed to the Turpin children, and the justification for refusing requests for financial assistance made on behalf of the children. Despite a host of benefits available to the children through government programs and individuals offering support, several of the adult Turpin children continue to be subjected to dangerous living conditions and a lack of access to basic needs, like healthcare, transportation, or even food. How is it possible to escape a home where you were purposefully starved, have over $500,000 in funds raised for you, and still go hungry? Jordan and her older sister Jennifer did an interview with Diane Sawyer for ABC News. Although she was dressed to a T and smiling, she admits she was not doing well at this time. After the Olguins were arrested, she was separated from her younger siblings by the agency and basically left to be homeless. Today, Jordan finally has her own apartment. She has established herself as an influencer on TikTok, where she often posts positive and upbeat messages for her thousands of followers. "I want to take what I went through and turn it into something positive," says Jordan. "I want people to know they're not alone and there is a way out." If it weren't for Jordan's bravery, all 13 Turpin siblings could be still locked inside that house of horrors. That is it for today's story. Join me on social media and tell me your thoughts on this one. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at Killer Stories Podcasts. Technically the same handle for TikTok, but honestly haven't posted there in ages. Continue to send your story suggestions as well as your first-hand close call stories. I started a new segment where I read your personal experiences with true crime. Previous episodes have featured a near-death experience, stories of spiked drinks, and a close call with a stranger in the woods. Your story could be featured next. Email killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. If you are enjoying the show, please take a moment to leave a preferably 5-star review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. It helps tremendously and is greatly appreciated. As always, thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.